solid front axle like on a Jeep Wrangler versus IFS or independent front suspension such as on this Lexus GX 460. Which one is better for off-roading? Today we're going to talk about it. Okay, IFS or independent front suspension versus a so-called solid front axle like on a Jeep Wrangler. Which one's better? First, where does this all come from? And it typically boils down to two argument points. One is articulation, two is durability. Now, traditionally, a solid front axle like on a Jeep Wrangler has always been able to offer more articulation versus an independent front suspension vehicle like on this Lexus GX 460. However, it is not an inherent thing to IFS that it needs to have less articulation. It's just a matter of how the engineers design each vehicle. In other words, engineers can make independent front suspension articulate just as much as a solid axle, if not more. Whether manufacturers choose to do that is up to the individual manufacturer. As it stands right now, things like Land Cruisers like this thing cannot out-articulate a Jeep Wrangler when it comes to the front suspension. Even though this Lexus GX 460 has a front and rear disconnectable sway bar, even with the sway bars disconnected, it still has less articulation than a Jeep Wrangler. Sounds great. The solid axle has more articulation, but there's a problem. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's skip to the second argument on IFS versus solid axle, and that is the durability or the perceived durability of the solid axle versus this IFS with its CV axles. Truth be told, a solid axle vehicle has the same size of axle shafts within the carrier or axle tube, whatever you want to call it, as this IFS vehicle. In other words, if you look inside that big Jeep Wrangler solid axle, inside you're going to see that the actual axles inside are like this thick. In fact, the axle shafts on this IFS GX 460 are thicker than most Jeep Wrangler front axles. So you can't make the argument that the solid axle has beefier axles because they're thicker. They're not. They're either the same exact size or, like I said, in many cases, they're bigger on an IFS vehicle. There's a so-called solid axle. Don't let the big tubing fool you. The actual axle is inside of that thing. Then comes the argument on U-joints versus CV joints. And frankly, they're both strong, and CV joints have a lot of advantages that, again, we'll get to in a second. Now, the big thing with IFS is since it has CV joints in the front, you have rubber boots, and those can rip on things like brush or any, stuff off-road, sticks and rocks and whatever, even though we've been all through all sorts of nonsense with this GX 460 and we've never ripped our front CV joint boots, the rubber boots. I'm still very conscientious when it comes to if I go off the trail and I gotta dodge, go through some brush or bushes or nonsense that hasn't been flattened by the trail. I have to be very conscientious to not rip those front CV boots. On a solid axle vehicle such as a Jeep Wrangler, you don't have to worry about that. There are no CV boots. Instead, there's U-joints. However, even Jeep Wrangler has front CV joints now on some of their Jeep Wrangler models. It's true. If you look at some Jeep models, they snuck in a CV joint and a rubber CV joint boot, just like on this GX 460. Many people aren't even aware of that, and they snuck it in for performance reasons. And that brings us to all the wonderful advantages of IFS or independent front suspension. And that is, frankly, solid axle vehicles are absolutely horrible on any other driving condition or road surface or practical scenario other than low speed off-roading. If you don't know what I'm talking about, driving a car or truck with a solid front axle is like driving the Home Depot rental truck. It's absolutely garbage, which is the reason why Toyota switched from solid front axles to IFS years ago. It just makes on-road driving so much better. There's advantages off-road too, because if you're into high speed off-roading or even moderate speed off-roading, it makes that experience a lot better, a lot easier to control, a lot more comfortable. CV joints have constant velocity, so they have the same amount of speed no matter which way you're turning. Jeeps with their U joints have a different velocity or different, levels of power if they turn. That's why Jeep on some of their Wranglers now incorporate CV joints on the front, trying to give back the user some of the stuff that's missing from the whole IFS thing going on with this. Now, as mentioned in the beginning, the Jeep with its solid front axle has absolutely phenomenal articulation. This vehicle, of course, has IFS in the front and a solid rear in the back. And on this vehicle, you can feel the rear going and articulating like crazy, and you can feel the limitations on the front. When you're in a Jeep Wrangler off-roading, you can feel both the rear and the front just articulating into every rut and climbing over every high spot. If your number one priority is getting that maximum articulation off-road and you don't care what it feels like once you're done with the trail, then something with a solid front axle like a Wrangler or Ineos Grenadier or whatever is going to be great for you. However, if you're like most people and you get off the trail in a solid front axle and your smile immediately turns to a frown for the remainder of your week because you're going to be spending the majority of your time on road and this thing is handling horrible and you could feel the front end seesawing back and forth in the steering wheel. If that's not your thing, then you're definitely going to want to get IFS, and it's why, again, most truck manufacturers either have independent front suspension now, front and rear, or definitely on the front. IFS is great for high-speed off-roading. Toyota has the TRD Pro 4Runner, and if Toyota was really true to high-speed off-roading, they'd actually put independent rear suspension on that thing versus the solid axle that it has. That way it would have independent front and rear suspension, and that thing would absolutely fly off-road and handle like a rally car off-road. IFS always feels better on and off-road. The only advantage, again, is that articulation factor. So how much articulation do you need? In my opinion, unless you're seriously going to be living on the trails and don't mind the crappy feeling that you get on road, a Jeep is awesome for you. But if you want to be able to do most black diamond trails out there, any solid rear axle IFS Toyota SUV will get you down most of those trails without any issue. And since when you're off-roading, you kind of leading with the front, in other words, you're driving your front tires, you know where they go because you're in front. It's kind of like a technique advantage because you know where your front tires are going really good. Once you get through an obstacle on your front tires, your rear tires are just kind of following and you're hoping that you, quote, stay on the line that you picked. Thus, since you can't see the rear axle, it makes sense in these Toyotas for it to be solid because you get a lot more allowance for like a margin of error on the rear. I hope that rambling made sense. If it didn't, what I'm trying to say is you can make up for the lack of articulation on IFS because it's in the front and you can see where you're going. If you make any mistakes, your rear will be much more forgiving because it has more articulation and you'll get through the obstacle just fine. So like all things, this comes down to the B word, balance. You have to decide what is better for you, maximum articulation or maximum overall enjoyment. Toyota didn't rip off the solid front axle on these Land Cruisers a year ago to be mean to you. They fully understand what articulation is. They understand the limits of IFS articulation. And in the current generations of Land Cruisers and LXs and GXs, they've actually improved both front and rear articulation versus these previous outgoing models. What that means is most Toyota engineers and most 4x4 manufacturer engineers with IFS know the limitations, and they're trying to close that gap between the articulation on a solid front axle and IFS. How they're going to do that, I don't know, but they're getting closer. Thus, which is better comes down to your personal preference. And remember, you're going to spend most of your time on road in your vehicle. It's just night and day. IFS feels so much better. Now, there's always going to be an argument that CV joints are weak and you will snap CV joints if you off-road versus a solid axle, and that's just nonsense. People you see who are snapping CV joints or front axles on their IFS are simply spinning the wheels and bouncing the car on rocks in a low range or high range or some range they're not supposed to be in. They're doing something wrong. It doesn't matter if you are in a Wrangler or a 4Runner. If you're going uphill and you're spinning wheels and bouncing the vehicle and bouncing around, your Wrangler will snap that axle, which is the same size as this IFS axle under the same condition. So snap axles are almost always user error. When you add in the whole idea of vanity modifications, put on big tires and lift kits and other nonsense with no skill, you end up with monster truck tires spinning and bouncing around on ice-covered hills and 4 low in rock mode, and then you snap something. Doesn't matter Jeep or Toyota, that's always going to happen. So forgetting about your personal preference, what would I say is the best? IFS. You got to live with your vehicle. We live off-road out here. We're on dirt every single day. And at the end of the day, no matter what your lifestyle is, you're going to be spending more time in your off-road vehicle on pavement. And the comfort, feel, handling characteristics, braking performance, acceleration performance, and all the other good stuff that come along with IFS cannot be matched by a solid front axle.